I didn't know grief could have an echo until the day my daughter-in-law stood in my son's kitchen, looked me in the eye, and said, "Honestly, Walter, you've always been more of a burden than a blessing." The room went still. My son said nothing. My grandchildren were in the next room, and I stood there, 63 years old, holding a casserole dish I'd driven 40 minutes to bring over, and I nodded slowly like a man who had learned long ago that some storms pass faster when you don't run from them. 3 months later, she called me. She wanted to see the property. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 64 now. I spent most of my working life as a civil engineer, the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and never once put his name on a project that wasn't done right. I raised my son Daniel mostly alone after his mother passed when he was 11. We didn't have much, but we had structure, honesty, and a small house in rural Virginia that I paid off before he finished high school. When Daniel married Christine, I tried. I genuinely did. I brought food when they were busy. I watched the grandchildren without being asked. I fixed the leaking pipe under their kitchen sink on a Sunday afternoon and refused to let Daniel pay me for the part. Christine smiled through most of it, the practiced smile of someone tolerating something they've decided they don't like. I noticed, but I let it pass. She was my son's wife. The grandchildren were half hers. You pick your battles when family is involved. The comment about being a burden happened at Thanksgiving. Not a private moment, not a whispered aside, but in front of Daniel's in-laws, 2 of their friends from the neighborhood, and my 8-year-old granddaughter, Lily, who looked up from her coloring book with wide eyes and then quickly looked back down. Christine had been drinking wine since noon. Daniel was at the stove and pretended he didn't hear. Later, he texted me from the driveway while I was loading my car. "Sorry about that." She didn't mean it. I didn't reply right away. I drove home, let myself into my apartment, and sat in the dark for a while. Not out of self-pity, out of decision. Because something had just shifted in me. The way the ground settles after a long rain, quiet and final. I want to be clear about what Christine thought she knew about me. She thought I was a man running on fumes. A widower in a 1-bedroom apartment who drove a 12-year-old truck and wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation. She told Daniel I had no real savings. She told her mother I was sweet but a little lost. She told the children once that Grandpa Walter had lived a simple life, which is the kind of thing people say when they mean small. What Christine didn't know, and what I had never felt the need to explain, was what I had been quietly doing for the better part of 20 years. After Daniel's mother passed, I made 2 decisions. The first was to raise my son well. The second was to never be caught without options again. So I worked. I saved. I tracked every dollar with the same discipline I brought to load-bearing calculations and drainage infrastructure. I didn't buy new when used would do. I didn't upgrade when what I had still worked. I put money into index funds in 2004 and never touched it. I contributed to my pension without fail. I inherited a piece of land outside Charlottesville from my uncle in 2011, 43 acres with a creek running through the back third of it, and I held on to it while everyone around me told me to sell. I didn't sell. I didn't talk about any of it either. Not because I was hiding something, but because it was mine. The way a man's thoughts are his own until he chooses to speak them. I had learned, over years of watching people perform their lives for each other, that quiet ownership is a different kind of confidence. It doesn't ask for witnesses. Christine had decided what my life looked like based on what she could see. The apartment, the truck, the flannel shirts. She never asked about the rest. After Thanksgiving, I gave myself 30 days to think clearly. I went to work. I cooked simple meals. I called Lily every Sunday and listened to her talk about her teacher and the class hamster named Biscuit. I did not mention Christine's comment to Daniel because I had learned a long time ago that asking a man to choose between his father and his wife is not love. It's leverage. I wasn't willing to do that to him. But I was done being a footnote in my own story. I had been thinking about the land for a while. My financial advisor, a plain-spoken woman named Ruth, who had been managing my accounts for 11 years, had been telling me for 2 years that the market had shifted and the timing was right. I'd been cautious. Cautious is how I'm built. But that Thanksgiving evening, sitting in my dark apartment with my coat still on, I decided cautious had done its job. It was time to build. I called Ruth the following Monday. We met on Wednesday. I reviewed the full picture, the land value, the pension, the investment accounts, the liquid savings. I ran the numbers myself that night, the way I always do, twice from different angles. By the end of the week, I had made a decision. I was going to build a house on that land. Not to prove something to Christine. I told myself that clearly, and I meant it. I was building because I had earned it, because the land had been waiting, and because at 63 years old I was finally ready to stop living like a man making temporary arrangements. I hired a small architectural firm in Charlottesville I had worked with professionally years earlier. I knew their standards. We sat down over 3 meetings and I told them exactly what I wanted. Not large, not showy. A single-story craftsman with wide porches on 2 sides, a proper workshop in the back, enough bedroom space for grandchildren to visit, and windows facing east so the morning light would come in over the hills without asking permission. I broke ground in late February. I told no one in Daniel's household. Daniel knew I owned the land. I had mentioned it once years earlier, and he had nodded the way young people nod at things that seem far off and unrelated to their immediate lives. He didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't offer them. Christine certainly didn't know. And I found, as the months passed, that I didn't mind the silence. I was too busy. I drove out to the site on Saturday mornings with coffee in the truck's cup holder and walked the perimeter while the crew worked. I watched the foundation pour. I watched the frame go up, board by board, against the Blue Ridge backdrop. I brought my level and checked things myself, not because I doubted the crew, but because I'm a man who needs to feel the work with his own hands to believe in it. The foreman, a quiet man named Gil, stopped raising an eyebrow at me after the 3rd week. He just handed me the plans when I arrived and let me walk. During those months, Christine's behavior continued in its usual pattern. She called once in February to ask if I could watch the grandchildren on a Tuesday while she went to an appointment. I said yes. She thanked me without warmth and hung up. Daniel texted twice about small things. I responded promptly. I attended my granddaughter Lily's spring recital and sat 3 rows back and watched her play the recorder with the particular concentration of a child who has practiced seriously. And I was proud in a way that had nothing to do with anything Christine had ever said about me. At Easter, the family gathered at Daniel's house again. Christine served a glazed ham and talked extensively about a kitchen renovation she was planning. At one point she mentioned, to no one in particular, that she hoped certain people wouldn't expect to be consulted about every decision since they didn't contribute to the household. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. Daniel changed the subject. Lily asked me if I wanted to see her new art project. I said yes, and followed her down the hallway, and spent 20 minutes looking at her watercolors of horses and mountains while the adults talked in the kitchen. Those 20 minutes were the best part of my Easter. I kept building. By June, the exterior was complete. By August, the interior work was finishing up. By late September, the house was done. I walked through it on a Thursday afternoon with Ruth and Gil, and we shook hands at the front porch. Ruth looked out over the hills and said, "Walter, this is something." I thanked her. Gil drove away. Ruth and I stood there a little longer. She knew the full picture. She was one of 3 people on earth who did. I moved in slowly over 2 weekends in October. I drove the truck myself, loaded and unloaded without help because I wanted the transition to belong entirely to me. The first morning I woke up there, I lay still for a minute listening to the silence, and it was a different silence from the apartment. Fuller. Like the land itself was breathing. I told Daniel I had moved over a phone call without details. He was surprised. He said, "Benna, moved where?" I gave him the address. He was quiet for a moment. "Is this the land from Uncle Carl?" I said it was. He was quiet again. Then he said he'd like to come see it. I told him he was welcome any time. He came the following Saturday, alone, without Christine. He stood in the driveway for a long moment before he came inside. He walked through the rooms the way people do when they're recalibrating something they thought they understood. He looked out the east-facing windows. He sat down at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee. He didn't say much. He's my son. He doesn't need to perform for me. Eventually he said, "Dad, how long have you been planning this?" I told him the truth. "A long time." He nodded. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "Christine doesn't know anything about this, does she?" It wasn't a question. I confirmed it wasn't. He nodded again, slowly. There was something moving behind his eyes that I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror during the years after his mother died. The specific expression of a man realizing a version of a story he had accepted was incomplete. "She's been telling people you're not doing well," he said carefully. "I know," I said. He looked up. "Did you know for how long?" "Long enough," I told him. He exhaled. We sat with that for a while. The coffee cooled between us. Outside, a red-tailed hawk crossed the window line and disappeared into the tree line beyond the creek. Daniel said, "I should have said something at Thanksgiving." I told him I understood why he didn't. I told him I didn't blame him. I meant both of those things. He came back the next weekend with the grandchildren, without Christine. Lily ran up both porch steps and stood at the railing looking out at the hills and said, in the voice of an 8-year-old experiencing genuine wonder, "Grandpa, this is like a painting." Her brother, 6-year-old Marcus, walked directly to the workshop in the back, looked at my tools, and announced he wanted to build something. I found him a piece of scrap wood and a hammer, and he went at it with complete seriousness while Lily and I sat on the porch and watched a storm roll in over the mountains, slow and dramatic and unhurried. That evening, after the children were in the truck and Daniel was getting ready to leave, he stopped at the porch steps and turned back to me. "She's going to want to see it," he said. "She'll make it about the kids, say they should be able to visit." I told him I was aware. He said, "What do you want me to do?" I thought about that for a moment. I told him the truth. I wasn't keeping her from the grandchildren. If she wanted to bring them out, that was fine. But I'd appreciate it if he were there too, the first time. He said he would be. The call came on a Tuesday evening in November. Christine's voice was carefully modulated, the version she used when she wanted something and knew the direct approach wouldn't work. She said she'd heard the children talking about the property and it sounded lovely. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings about Thanksgiving, that she sometimes speaks without thinking when she's stressed. She said she'd love to bring the children out sometime, if I was open to it. I said Saturday worked for me. 2:00. She arrived at 2:07. I was on the porch when she turned into the gravel drive, and I watched her through the windshield as the house came into full view. She stopped the car before she reached the parking area. Just stopped it, mid-drive. She sat there for several seconds. I don't know what she was looking at. The porch, the windows, the workshop, the land rolling out behind the house toward the creek. Something in her went quiet in a way that was visible even from a distance. She got out of the car carefully. The children ran toward the porch immediately. Marcus wanted to show her the birdhouse he and I had started building the week before. Lily took her hand and pulled her up the steps. Christine let herself be pulled. Her eyes were moving the way eyes do when a person is trying to reconcile two different pictures of the same place. Daniel stood beside me and said nothing. His presence was enough. Christine stepped through the front door and stopped in the entry. She looked at the ceiling, the floors, the light coming through the east windows. She moved through the rooms the way Vanessa had in the story I once heard about a man who built his life the same quiet way I had built mine. Checking corners, looking for the seams. She went to the workshop window and looked out at the land. She stood there long enough that Marcus had to pull her sleeve to get her attention, When she came back to the kitchen, I had coffee on the table. She sat down across from me. Her hands were still. Her voice, when she finally used it, was smaller than usual. "You built this," she said. "I did," I replied. She looked at the table. "The land was always yours?" "Since 2011, I said. She nodded slowly. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," I said. I kept my voice even, not unkind, not sharp, just honest. She looked up then, and to her credit, she didn't deflect. She didn't perform confusion or manufacture offense. She just sat with it, which was the most honest thing I'd ever seen her do. "I said something at Thanksgiving," she began. "You did," I agreed. "That was wrong," she said. I told her I appreciated that. I meant it. What I said next, I had been thinking about for a while, not as a speech, but as a truth. I needed to say clearly so there would be no ambiguity between us going forward. I told her that I understood families are complicated, that I had never wanted to be an intrusion in her marriage or her household, that I had tried over the years to be useful without overstepping. But I told her also that I was not the man she had decided I was, that I had built a life, deliberately and carefully over many decades, and that her version of me had never matched the reality, only the parts she chose to look at. I told her that going forward, I wasn't asking her to like me. I was asking her to be accurate. She was quiet for a long time. The children were on the porch. I could hear Marcus narrating something to Lily in the voice he used when he was being an authority on a subject. Christine looked out the window toward the hills, and something in her posture changed. The slight deflation of a person releasing a position they had been holding too long. "I told Daniel's aunt you were struggling," she said finally. "I know," I said. "I told his friends the same thing, at the barbecue last summer." "I know that too," I said. She looked at me. "Are you going to tell them the truth?" I told her the truth was already telling itself. That Daniel knew now. That the children had been here. That her own eyes had seen what she'd seen. I told her I didn't need to make announcements or send corrections. I told her the house would speak for itself over time, and so would I. She nodded. It was a slow nod, the kind that carries more weight than agreement. The kind that says, "I understand what I have done, and I am not certain what to do next." I poured her more coffee. She accepted it. We sat at that table for another 30 minutes, not in warmth exactly, but in something closer to honesty than we had ever managed before. The children came in twice, once for water and once to show Christine the birdhouse in progress. She looked at it carefully and said Marcus had done good work on the joints. He beamed. She glanced at me when she said it, and I understood that she was trying, in the small currency available to her in that moment, to begin something different. I was willing to let her. Daniel drove the children home that evening. Before he left, he came to the porch alone while Christine buckled them into the car. He put his hand on my shoulder, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, and the gesture surprised me then too. "Thank you," he said. I asked him what he was thanking me for. "For not making me choose," he said, "and for being right without making a point of it." I told him it wasn't about being right. He said, "What was it about?" I thought about that for a moment. The hills were going dark in the west. The porch light was on. Somewhere down by the creek, something moved in the brush. It was about building something true, I told him. Something no one could talk away. Something that would still be standing after every version of the story people told about me had finished being told. He nodded. He went to his car. He drove his family down the gravel road, and I watched the taillights until they disappeared around the tree line. I stayed on the porch a while longer. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpens things, that makes the stars look closer than they have any right to be. I could hear the creek from where I sat. I had always been able to hear it on nights like this, even before the house was here. Back when I used to drive out alone and walk the land in the dark, just to remind myself it was real. I have spent most of my life being underestimated by people who mistook my quiet for emptiness. It is an easy mistake to make. Quiet men don't correct the record in real time. We don't perform our worth for rooms that aren't ready to receive it. We build instead. We track the numbers. We hold the land. We show up on Sundays and listen to our grandchildren talk about hamsters named Biscuit and teachers who assign too much homework. We wait, not because we're weak, but because we understand that truth is not time-sensitive. It will arrive. It always does. If you've ever been written off by someone who only saw your surface, who looked at your truck or your apartment or your flannel shirt and decided they already knew the whole story, I want to say this directly. Let them talk. Let them believe their version for as long as they need to. Put your head down and build. Not for the reveal, not for the moment their expression changes when the truth comes into view, but for yourself. For the specific satisfaction of knowing exactly who you are when no one is watching and no one is impressed. That satisfaction doesn't make noise. It doesn't need to. It just stands there in the morning light, solid and real, waiting quietly for anyone who finally wants to see it clearly. If this story sat with you, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you're someone who has learned the particular patience of building something true in silence, I think you'll find more stories worth your time right here.